Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar called What Every IT Manager Needs to Know About Lean Management. My name is Troy Dumoulin and I'm a Vice President with Pink Elephant and a volunteer with the Lean IT Association and advocate of using service management in the context of a larger premise of value streams, and with that comes the understanding of lean principles. This session is being recorded, so those of you who have registered and those of you who are attending, which is not exactly the same number of people, these are going to receive by the end of a couple of days a link of the recorded session that you can review or share as you wish. This is a computer audio setup, so I understand there are a few people struggling with their local setups and having difficulty with audio. I apologize. At this moment, this webinar has Voice over IP as the audio option. All right, so let's begin our session. So for the last few years, one of the personal journeys that I've been on is the realization that the lean concepts of flow, of value realization, of orientating around a value stream are critical for the understanding of any organization in the business of service delivery, of value creation. And as we know, historically, we have, well, late 1800s, early 1900s, lean goes way back to the application in the manufacturing industry. However, in recent years, we've seen it applied across multiple different verticals. The most recent adoption being in the services industry, healthcare, and higher education, and now we talk about lean IT. The reality is it's simply lean applied to various value streams for various verticals. So the conversation we're going to have around lean in its application to IT is perhaps a bit unique only in the context that the value streams that we use in the concept of plan, build, run, or in a lean premise, we should start with demand, plan, build, run, or from a service management concept, we look at the ITIL aspect of strategy, design, transition, operation. All of this refers to a horizontally oriented value stream where demand comes in one side, we build value based on requirements, and then we run that value in operation. In fact, until we actually deliver that value into the final stage, you can actually state that value hasn't been realized. So the plan build or development, that builds the potential for value. But a value stream orientation, a value system orientation, has to look at the end-to-end, cradle-to-grave aspect of understanding horizontal value delivery. The key with lean is to look at that value stream and to see how do we optimize the flow, because the faster that we can actually deliver that value, the sooner it's realized and the higher value that the customer actually receives. So the agenda for our webinar this afternoon is fourfold. Before we begin talking about the details of the lean IT application to IT value streams, we'll first talk about why should you care. We'll call it the business problem. And I'll represent to you some interesting dilemmas facing our IT industry and our vertical that perhaps isn't unique to us, but very specific to the world we live in today. And then we'll look at what does lean have to do or have to offer in the context of the challenges we face. Third agenda item, we'll then look at the integration of lean and service management. I'll bring in as well the agile and the DevOps concept there as well, because it's one large value system that we're talking about. And then we'll look at specific lean tools in respect to identifying how to improve the velocity of flow, the velocity of the delivery of value to the end consumer. And that's where we're going to look at understanding what are the impedance to flow. And that could be waste, that could be high variability, that could be defect. We'll see different examples of how that can actually impact today the world that we work and live in IT. So let's begin with why should we care? So let's face it, for several decades now, we have been doing the business of IT. We have been delivering value, and that hasn't changed. And from the onset of our industry, we have been in a situation where we receive demand and we actually build and supply that value. So the demand supply chain concept is something that is not new. This is something that service management is based on. The fact is we have to understand what is our competency and capability of demand supply, and that, while new, the challenge with what we have today, and I'm just going to grab my laser pointer here, is that what is really changing is not the fact that we're actually receiving demand. What is changing today is the increased demand velocity. So in the world we live in today, with services built on the web, where the expectation of the service consumer is, I don't have 3 months, I don't have 3 weeks, I want it yesterday. The reality is the rate of change has increased exponentially, and that demand that we're going to see coming in has been increasing in its velocity. However, the challenge with this is, while demand speed or rate of demand is increasing, our capability to scale to meet demand is not. I'd like you to think about this. What took us this far, based on optimizing our technical domains in various silos, can no longer get us where we need to go. What took us this far cannot take us further. So today, the world we live in is highly oriented to the vertical silo optimization. And in that context, think about it this way. There's dev, and then there's ops, and within each of those major camps, we have multiple silos again, and we have very little integration of priority, understanding of common goals and objectives. Each of these silos is being optimized in their own right, not necessarily as a collective whole or value system. And we have a great degree of fragmentation. We have multiple processes for doing practically anything. In fact, one of the interesting premises is that people say, well, our processes are immature. My personal opinion is not a question of immaturity, it's a question of standardization. The reality is that we don't have a problem with a lack of process. We have so many processes we can't shake a stick at it. The reality is we have multiple ways of managing change. We have multiple ways of managing inventory. We have multiple ways of capturing demand. We have multiple ways of designing and developing services. And this variability and fragmentation is actually one of the things that impedes flow, which we're going to come back to at the end of our session today. So the challenge is we're dealing in a fragmented world where we have fragmented processes, we have fragmented applications and platforms and the tools we use for this, and we have fragmented leadership in the way that we're looking at vision. So what do we do with this? Well, we have to start looking at standardization. The reality is the key goal here is not so much to mature, but to standard, because standardization, where we're actually moving down to fewer options of the above, will actually be the best thing we can actually do in the context of speeding up velocity. Now, along the way, if we can access or use some reference models, that's even better. But the interesting thing here is the first goal is fragmentation, because the more fragmentation we have, the first goal is standardization, I should say. The more fragmentation we have, the more complexity we have. The more complexity we have, the more potential for risk. The more potential for risk, the more defect. Now, this challenge is leveling us off, but it's not just leveling us off. I'd like you to think about your own environments right now, where there's a tendency, for example, to move to a higher degree of third-party utilization. So we're using cloud offers and going more and more offshore. We're adding more complexity. The challenge with this is that many organizations, the dotted line that you see here isn't actually improving, it's actually going this direction. Well, the speed of demand is going up, and the gap we see here is widening. So one of the challenges we face here is simply not being able to keep up with demand with our current capability for velocity. Now, that's one aspect. The second aspect I'd like to introduce to you is a model called the IT paradox. It's an interesting model. It's an economic model. And the way this works is that any organization goes through a normal life cycle. This organization in its early stage will be in a growth period. And in this period of growth, the solid line represents business revenue. I'm getting more business, I'm getting more market share, and because of all of these things, demand, of course, is growing in the IT context. But the issue is here, or it's actually not an issue, because we're in a growth stage and money is coming in hand over fist. If we need more capacity, we need more anything, we put our hand out and there we go. We get more budget. So in a growth period of time, there's really no constraint or no focus on waste reduction or variability or issues of flow, because we can throw more money bodies at it and we basically can fix the issue. However, this doesn't last forever for any of us. The reality is that we'll then move eventually into a stable, steady state scenario. And this could be driven by an economic condition like a recession, where we actually see a flattening out of new purchases from on the business side, or we're seeing in general the market become now more saturated with competition. So now our products become more commoditized. And what happens at this state of an organization's maturity is that the business now looks to IT and says, well, we need to retain our profitability, we need to retain our margin. So the way we're going to do that is through business process automation. So at the very point where business revenue is beginning to flatten out, what we're seeing is that demand begins to increase exponentially. However, the catch-22 in this situation is that IT funding begins to level out. Now, if that wasn't, the most challenging scenario, we actually move forward into the third phase, and this is a decline. Again, this could be an economically driven decline based on an economic model like a recession, or it could be simply the organization is beginning to lose ground against the market it's competing in. At this point, obviously, what we're seeing is a decline in business revenue because of loss of market share, but they're now desperate for cost savings relative to automation. And so at this point, we see an increasing rate of demand, but at also the same time, we see a decreasing perspective of IT funding. Now, consider this. So you probably have already started to place your own organization in this life cycle model, and I'd like you to ask yourself the question, where do you see the basic need for an organization to realize that it needs a lean approach? The reality is you would start hopefully to see it here, but most organizations will actually be still hoping the good days, the gravy train, is still around. So in my experience, most organizations will actually be closer to the decline when they start to realize that this gap between demand and supply, this gap in funding with demand, is now something that must be paid attention to. So it's at this point that the organization begins to think, how can I work smarter, not harder? How can I remove waste that I don't necessarily need to consider? How do I basically stop doing the crazy stuff that doesn't make any sense and delivers value? So this is the world where lean becomes something that you would care about in your organization. So that's the premise of why should I care from a business perspective. So now look at the way we consider lean thinking and why managers have to understand what lean is all about. So lean is really, it's not a methodology. It's not a framework. It's not a series of prescriptive books. While there is a set of tools that lean offers to understand visualizing work and how to identify waste, it's really more of a way of thinking about things. The first and foremost goal is that we're looking at it from the point of view of the customer value proposition. And in that context, if you look at the house of lean here to the right, when we look at what is value, we have to understand value is always multidimensional. There is, I get the goal achieved, the quality, the expectation is realized. But if I deliver that quality, but it's a day late, there is still a challenge now with value realization. And if that cost is over and above the expected cost, there's still now a dissatisfier in the context of value. So value from the perspective of a lean perspective always looks at just in time and at the right level. In essence, value from a lean perspective is fit for purpose. Now, how we get there is through a number of different thinking models. First of all, we don't have time and you've noticed no funding, so we have to basically self-fund our way into process improvement. So let's find a way to stop doing the crazy stuff, the stuff that no one should be thinking about doing. What is waste? How do I identify waste? What are methods for eliminating the non-essential aspects of anything that we do, whether that's building software or building servers or moving to production? How do I optimize the flow in velocity by removing non-necessary activity? By doing that, there's an interesting principle in Lean. One of the best ways we can actually identify issues that impede flow, like waste, is we visualize work. And this is a premise called jidoka. Jidoka is a Japanese word. There's lots of Japanese words on here, which I won't go into in this webinar. But this premise is jidoka is about making the invisible visible, making defects visible, making, in this case, waste or bottlenecks or issues such as variation visible in such a way that I can identify bottlenecks. I can identify where I can optimize certain activities to increase horizontal flow. If I can't see it, I can't deal with it. This is one of the areas that Lean provides a lot of great tools, tools such as Kanban, where I have a pool scheduling system that allows me to watch the flow of work across multiple teams and identify where the constraints in flow across that collaboration is happening. In the concept of day start meetings, we have day boards and week boards and improvement boards. Again, visual management tools that allow the management and leadership to understand what are the challenges impeding flow. And this comes back to the role of management, and that is a Lean belief that the best people who understand what are the opportunities for continual improvement are the people that do the work. So in the premise of Lean, a leader, a manager, is about facilitating the engagement of all employees in identifying value streams and involving those same employees in the identification of the removal of impedance to flow. The challenge we're dealing with here is we need to preserve value with less work. This is all about doing more with less. And of course, that's the world we all live in the IT context. We start with the principles of Lean, and it begins right in the middle. So as we saw in the previous slide, it all begins with a perspective of what does the customer understand as value. But we'll understand that the voice of customer is one voice. That's something we'll deal with in a minute. But still the starting point of value begins with identifying what is it that the customer would deem critical to quality for this to achieve its quality, its just-in-time, and its cost aspects. Now, that's the first principle. The second principle of Lean is that value is delivered via value streams. And these are horizontal activities that typically involve multiple functions, multiple roles, multiple departments. Unless I can actually visualize the value stream, I can visualize the activity of flow, I cannot understand what in essence is impeding it. So once I can actually put it in a picture, a value stream map, I can start identifying things like inventory that's basically piling up in front of a given workstation. And that could be, in a sense, inbox that's basically overflowing for an individual because they're involved in too many value streams. They have an issue of overburden. That could be an issue of rework, where the same form gets filled out 3 times before it's completed. That could be an issue of variation, where the fact that we have too many variable ways of doing things slows things down. But until I actually can see it, I can't understand what is causing impedance in flow. Another key belief that Lean brings to the table is we only work on stuff that we have orders for. This is the premise of pull. And rather than understanding what do we think the business needs, how do we establish demand channels? In a session I did a couple of weeks ago at another webinar, I talked about the 3 demand channels of service management, which we'll see in this session in a few slides. But looking at strategic demand, tactical demand, operational demand, and understanding how all of this demand will actually trigger portfolio decisions around moving the portfolio investment where it needs to be business requirements, again, based on that life cycle premise. And then finally, we have the concept of perfection, where we believe, ideally, that we're never done figuring out how to continually improve flow and continue to improve the value aspect of critical to quality. So the challenge we also face in our culture, in our vertical, is that while we value and focus on the voice of customer, the other voices that we have to deal with are also legitimate. And so Lean looks at balancing the fact that, again, value is multidimensional. If I deliver to the customer the features and the functions they want that they've identified in their user stories, but have done so in such a way that I put the business at risk and we lose key critical business data, or we do something of a fraudulent nature and we basically find our CEO in an orange jumpsuit going to a place that she doesn't want to go, I haven't done anyone any favors. So the reality is we live in this schizophrenic situation where we have multiple voices in our heads, and this is just the fact of life. We have to balance these voices, and at various times it's true that the various voices will actually have higher priorities than others, but we have to consider the voice of customer, the economic concerns of the business, the legislation, and even the concept of where the process informs us we can optimize flow are all voices that we have to understand, because in premise, we have to deliver both on speed, but do speed in such a way that we still ensure and assure that we deliver stable, secure, reliable services. So this is why we have to look at both functional requirements and non-functional, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. So consider the nature of change. When we consider continuous improvement, you can think about it in the concept of different granularities, different sizes of change. One of the words that you probably have heard in the lean circles is Kaizen. Kaizen is a Japanese word. These are all Japanese words. Kaizen in this case is a two-part word, kai, change, zen, for the better. So a Kaizen opportunity is an incremental change. And a core belief in the lean community is that the summation of a number of small incremental changes will probably be more effective than a larger step change because of the sheer political and financial and complexity ability to actually make smaller changes over larger ones. But if I continually look for opportunities to tweak and tune flow by optimizing the most opportune element of the value stream, over time, I have exponential improvement. So there's a strong belief in the premise of incremental change, which is Kaizen. And in that context, we can talk about Kaizen events. And in the Kaizen event, we go through the DMAIC life cycle of define and then measure, analyze, improve, and control, where we can turn an improvement around in simply a matter of days. However, these are just one aspect of change. We also have Kaikeku, which is a larger step change. This is like where you are living in a world where you're moving from a major application version to a subsequent major version. And it's a systemic change that's happening, and it's a larger change. And then Kakushin is the world of transformational change. All of these changes are viable. They can actually all happen at the same time. And Lean acknowledges that different applications need to be used in the different change scenario. One of the myths I'd like to address right now is the concept of waste identification and removal. Because often the first word that people think about in Lean is waste. Now, the reality is, come back to the basic premise of Lean. The basic premise of Lean is to deliver value, but to optimize flow, to reduce lead time and cycle time, to make it as quick as possible. So while waste identification is important because waste is an impedance to flow, the way we go about waste identification and removal has to be considered strategic, not simply tactical. So I don't want you to think about that lean is kind of like a whack-a-mole game where you see waste, kill waste. No, what we're looking at here, first of all, a lean organization identifies its true north. What are the goals? What are the vision? What's the mission? And identifying what good looks like helps us to then do a current state assessment, and then I understand the gap. So this is the premise of strategic identification. Now, the reality is, I'm sure you've all recognized this in your own organizations, is that when you begin looking hard at what you do, you find many, many opportunities for improvement. Target-rich environment is a phrase that comes to mind. The thing is, lean would look at this variety of improvements and then set a set of prioritization methods to say which improvement would make the most change, the most value in this scenario. So it's not about the boy here just plugging his finger in the dike and just closing down one change. It's a much more strategic aspect of understanding what is the value proposition we're trying to achieve and what are the incremental improvements in a prioritized way that we can actually complete to move us in the right direction. So in essence, lean, specifically around Kaizen and incremental change, is a structured problem-solving methodology for doing continual improvement. Now, to bring this again back to home to kind of the IT value stream premise, one of the challenges we face today in the fragmentation discussion we had early on in the webinar is that we don't really consider or look at the IT value stream as an enterprise. The term enterprise is often thrown around, but many organizations have different meanings to this. Enterprise could be enterprise operations or enterprise application. Enterprise, in the true meaning of the word, means we have a value stream that begins with a customer engagement dialogue. It establishes a set of requirements for building out net new value or optimizing current value, and then we get to run that in production. So I want to take a moment to kind of identify two key words: agile versus velocity. So we hear the word agile quite a bit these days. And agile in itself, it's not a negative word, but what it simply means is I'm quick, I'm nimble, I'm flexible, I'll move I'll move on a dime, as they say. But the problem with agile in a value system is this. What happens if each of the various major agents in my value system are all being agile in different directions? They're all optimizing their own vertical without consideration of their total value stream involvement. The very nature of agile, without the context of the value stream, can actually kill velocity. So if I optimize my plan and build, but not my move to production and operations processes, the flow optimization I'm hoping to obtain is not going to occur. So one of the challenges we have today is that enterprise concepts are often missing, because in premise, governance is supposed to be over the entire value system. And CSI is looking at flow in the context of the entire demand plan build or strategy design transition operations premise. You see, the weakest link in this context is going to drive or impede the speed of the value system. And this is a concept called the theory of constraints, that the value system will not flow or operate any faster than its limiting bottleneck. The weakest link controls the flow. So this is why I prefer to look at service management in the context of this picture. So most of you, or many of you on the call, probably have been very familiar with the ITIL framework for a long time. It's a great and awesome framework that describes a process architecture from the premise of the customer engagement right to the operate premise. What I like to do is look at it a little bit differently, and I'm going to take that and take it out of a circle and move it into a value system concept. So on the front end here, we have the storefront. And on the storefront, we have a series of engagement processes that allow us to engage with our customer, deliver value, yes, but primarily for this purpose, let's talk about the concept of understanding demand intake. So in the world of strategic demand, we have a role and a function called the business relationship management function, identifying strategic opportunities to optimize value delivery for the customer. But we also have a catalog. And that catalog, if we're looking at it carefully, is being carefully analyzed for ordering patterns. We know what's being ordered, and we do more of that. We know what's not being ordered, identify the fact that we have potentially services that no one wants, and ideally we actually start to change our offers relative to the order analysis we do within our catalog. And then, of course, we're talking to people on a regular basis. They're giving us real-life experience, complaints about how they're using and experiencing services. All of this, be it operational or tactical or strategic input, are all demand channels, which is pull, into our factory concept. Now, even the concept of a factory basically puts off some IT professionals because there's this belief, well, we're not a factory, we're an art, we're artistes, we're not manufacturing. I want to have you think about that for a moment. The reality is we're a service organization. And in the world of a service organization, we live and we exist for the sole reason of receiving demand and basically supplying on that demand. Now, there's a lot of negative banter out there in the industry today about IT shouldn't be an order taker organization. Well, I want you to imagine what life would be if you didn't receive any orders. Well, that means we wouldn't have any business, we wouldn't have any funding, and we wouldn't be able to pay our bills and feed our children. So it's not about the fact that it's about being an order organization. We'd want to become a strategic partner in that dialogue versus a transactional widget supplier. That's a true statement. But understanding and enabling a system that understands demand and then based on that demand makes strategic decisions around portfolio investment decisioning, which then kicks off project activities. This is the conveyor belt here of the factory floor. And whether you're using agile methodologies or classic waterfall, that doesn't really matter. The build practice of your organization is where you're generating that new value. Now, ideally, yes, you're using a small batch premise, and agile is tuned to that. So lean talks about incremental, small batch versus larger batch. And this is where the agile space is really leveraging a lot of lean concepts. But the developer, let's think about it this way. Think about you're listening to the user stories. It is coming through this dialogue here. Now, the developer will understand feature. They'll understand function. They'll understand what the thing must do to deliver value. But remember the other voices we have to understand in order to ensure that we keep people out of jail and we don't do things which are economically silly. The other side of this coin, the non-functional requirements, are coming from the service management capabilities up here. So think about this conveyor belt moving along, and now I'm integrating into my sprint requirements for supplier integration. I'm integrating into my sprint disaster recovery considerations. I'm integrating into my sprint the requirements around monitoring and support going into production. This is what DevOps talks about as moving operational requirements earlier in design. Without the service management processes up here, informing the build will deliver that wonderful aspect of feature, but the non-functional requirements will not necessarily be in place that allow us for the multi-dimensional premise of value generation. And then finally, we move into production in such a way that we're orchestrating multiple levels of change, multiple levels of risk in such a way that we optimize our move to production. Now, it is critical that we're, again, optimizing flow. What we need is a low friction path to production. I didn't say no friction, I said low friction. What that simply means is I have multiple channels of move to production, stuff that's risky and heavy, we need to do through more due diligence, but things which are pre-approved standard, automated in such a way that they've been tested and validated to be successful, we move into lower friction channels to production. So key premise of DevOps, again, with the lean premise of optimizing flow is we move more and more of our move to production activities into lower risk activities through standardization, again, another lean principle, so that I can actually automate more, so that I optimize the flow to value creation. If I don't consider this and only optimize my build activities, again, the constraint will be governing the speed of the system. This is why it's incredibly important to understand the entire value chain. So the ideal concept is you now have value delivered, and of course, value requires maintenance. Maintenance will require someone to be, a truck to be sent out to fix things, and hopefully, ideally, we learn from our lessons and we get better at the entire system of value creation. But this is the challenge. If we're only looking at ITIL from a point of view of incident, problem, and change, we're not looking at it from the point of view of entire value stream. If we're only looking at involving optimization around our SDLC or project management methodology, we're still not going to optimize the entire system. So understanding value stream concepts in this premise of service management is critical to deliver on the value flow optimization goal of DevOps. Because in the end, we're in one value system. And a key belief or a key objective in a common value system is that all the agents, the participants, the members of this value stream, to operate in a common way, need to share common beliefs, common practices, common prioritization. Our challenge is that we have conflicting goals, and these seemingly conflicting goals, which are normal, by the way, based on our earlier voice conversation, don't encourage collaboration. They encourage conflict. The challenge is we don't even like each other half the time. We're not going to deal with optimizing flow until we deal with the cultural issues of silo mentality. And a critical thing that Lean brings to the table to enable a better understanding of shared values and priorities is this premise of value stream thinking. When you understand you're in a value stream, you understand that value is delivered through flow, and flow requires velocity, and velocity demands agreement on practice and priority. So it's interesting, we've been talking a lot about Lean and now service management. You can look at this as well in the concept of a maturity model of culture. Because everyone understands flow, but the reality is that their perspective of flow will be limited on what they currently believe their role is in the context of a larger business ecosystem. I'd like you to think about it this way. At the early stage of this model, which this model, by the way, was initially developed as part of the Planning to Implement Service Management book of ITIL, at the bottom, we have a technically oriented organization. Pretty much, it's every department for themselves. There is no such thing as value systems or streams outside. So flow in this concept is limited to departmental flow. So I know what it is to optimize flow of a server build or optimize the flow of software development. But after that, I'm not involved. That's not who I am. I'm not part of that larger clan or family or system. So my focus right now is department. Think about the horse with the blinders on. Okay, the things that are restricting their vision from left and right. We move up this model, and now I begin to start to see, okay, well, we have infrastructure processes and we have application development processes. So we start to think systems-oriented because we're starting to think connectivity and dependency and systems thinking, but we still have this us and them premise of that's dev and I'm ops. So in this concept, flow will be really just now related to the premise of I'm an operations person, so process exists only within operations. There is no process or value stream that crosses both. This is where a lot of organizations are because a lot of the development organizations don't see the need or their role in a service management context. They code, they do development. I move up this chain of conversation and culture, and I now believe that I have an enterprise IT function. So it doesn't matter if it's dev or ops or if you're internal or external, anyone who manages the greater information services resource pool anyone involved in that context is part of an enterprise IT function. Regardless of where you are in the org chart, you're part of some connected tissue managing information systems. Now you start to believe in the premise of flow across enterprise. So there's a common support model now across the organization. We have a single change process for moving things into production, which is the common data center. So we now believe in the concept of enterprise flow. But eventually what happens is at this point, we still are a challenge with this mythical separation of church and state between the business and IT, because you'll be sitting across the table from your business partner, and you'll be thinking, well, that's the business, and I'm IT. You're sharing a logo, but the reality is there's this mythical view that somehow that's the business across the table from you, and you're not in the business, you're over here in IT. Think about this. Is IT the only service provider in the business ecosystem? Is HR a service provider? Is facilities a service provider? Do they have products? Do they have services? Finance, service organization. So being a service organization doesn't separate you from the larger business ecosystem. And now you begin to understand that this separation is a myth. And now you start to believe and understand that the focus should really be, or include, it's always building from the bottom, inclusive of all the ones previous. Now you start worrying about business process flow. So you're in a business meeting to talk about process optimization of the business process, and you're not thinking, well, that's the business process versus my process. You're understanding you're just part of that larger context. And then finally, when you understand that the entire business ecosystem is delivering value to an external market, now you're in meetings talking about the flow of products and goods and services through value streams like order to cash, cash to deliver. And the IT professional doesn't believe that somehow they're in this meeting by mistake, because the reality is all business processes are automated and digitized. So there is no separation between the business process and its underlying automation. There is no separating IT as the line from the business. But again, the reality is, depending on where you are in this cultural premise, your understanding, your observation of what flow considers you are concerned with will change completely. And it's simply a matter of perspective, because as you probably have already assumed, it's all true right to the top, but the average IT organization culturally is down here. So they're still struggling with the premise of enterprise flow. What value streams cross dev and ops? But again, understanding the problem is half of the battle. And so what we're dealing with here is a cultural challenge, and a cultural challenge which is greatly improved when you begin thinking value streams. So the final part of our presentation is to talk about some of the tools, not all of them, but some of them that allow us to look at a value stream, visualize that value stream, understand how do I make flow happen with higher velocity. This is the old premise of working smarter, not harder. So one of the things that Lean gives us is a common language to describe things that impede or stop flow from happening. And so the three big M's, Japanese again, muda. This is the crazy stuff, the stuff we shouldn't be doing, the reports we keep generating that no one reads, the documents that we write that basically should be 10 times shorter because the reality is no one reads beyond the executive summary, the features we put in that no one asked for. So these are the things that just doesn't make sense. But that's not the only way that flow is impeded. Mura is variation or variance. And so what that means is simply this. It could actually come in two bases. Variation could be we have multiple ways of doing the same thing. And so when we try to integrate that one thing, it slows down. So imagine, if you will, someone calls the external call center of your organization, and they have their own process and system of record for capturing the customer issue. They then pass that on to the internal IT service desk, and they transfer that into another system of record who have another process with another set of policies for classifying prioritization. It needs to go to a second or third level support within another business unit. Again, we pass it to another system of record with another process, with another set of policies, and then it might need to go outside of your organization to third-party support again and again and again. This constant variation can only have one impact on speed. Identifying those variations and trying to minimize them, if not eliminate them, is a key way of understanding how to improve flow velocity. Another aspect is simply multiple ways of doing things. Even if you have multiple tools all supporting the same process, the very nature of having redundancy may or may not be necessary, may just be political, but the reality of carrying 5 tools that do the same thing or 3 tools that do the same thing will cost you in the context of flow because of the maintenance and integration required. And then Muri is a concept called overburden, an interesting concept. And the lean principle here applies that lean isn't about maximization. We're going to see that. In fact, we'll go to that next slide and talk about this in the concept of 3 types of work. So everything we do in life can be classified into 3 basic categories. There's stuff that we do that delivers value directly. I'm coding an application to deliver a new feature. I'm basically doing things that that enable this new thing to happen. Okay, this is value add, is work that actually specifically and directly contributes to value. We optimize that. Note not the word maximize. Necessary non-value is that administrative task, that glue that we do, that unless we kept that going, unless we were doing the reporting and creating the dashboards and putting the process governance in place, we know, because of the nature of entropy, all systems decay without energy and without governance, that this thing would basically fall apart at the seams. And so we need the glue that binds, but the reality is just enough. If we over-engineer what Lean calls necessary but non-value added activity, then we're also impeding because we're doing too much of something not necessary. And then finally, there's that stuff we need to stop doing, like resolving the same incidents over and over again. You can think of more. But the key word I want to bring into the Muri conversation is this. Think about any resource in a value system. That resource could be a person, it could be a machine, it doesn't matter. What happens if I run that machine hot? That person is overworked. They're working at 110%. They're taking their email home. They can only look at it at night after 10 o'clock, after the kids go to bed, or at 5 in the morning before everybody wakes up. They're now working weekends because they're trying to keep up with the rate of demand, but their speed of velocity can't do it. That's the first slide. What invariably will happen to that resource if I maximize that resource? Of course, you're already thinking, they get sick, they go home, they burn out, they look for another job. Exactly. In fact, where do I have time to optimize for innovation? Where do I have time to even consider improvements, continual improvement? In principle, taking an arbitrary number, the average resource should not be utilized more than 80% for planned work. Because after that, we begin to lose the slack we need to basically do the good stuff, the innovation, the CSI, the looking for opportunities to improve. Most of us, though, will experience the fact that most of us are maximized, and the fact is nothing's happening or changing because of that. So when we overburden an organization, we invariably slow it down. We don't get faster, we actually get slower by adding more work to people. So a key concept that we would look at a Kanban board, and a Kanban board, again, is a visual way of looking how work flows across a value system, is called work in progress limits. If I can optimize, this is the optimum amount of work that should flow through this task at any one time, I can increase velocity by enabling flow through work in progress optimization. Key point that Lean brings to the table. Maximization bad, optimization key. So the reality is we have a desire to do the right thing. We would like to be focusing on planned work, not unplanned work, but it doesn't seem to change. We seem to be on this hamster wheel of death. we just can't get off of it because we don't have time to stop and start looking at the killers of our flow. Yeah, for those of you who have a young family, you might remember a Disney film called The Emperor's New Groove, and remember that? The guy said, oh man, you threw off my groove. Well, there are many things that throw off our flow. And these aspects are what Lean calls aspects or categories of waste. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but the reality is each of these things has the potential for killing flow in our value stream. To give you some examples of waste, though, in our world, take a look at this slide. I'm not going to read every single one of them. I just want you to read through these key bullets and self-identify a little bit here. So, let's take the first one. I've been in many organizations, mind you, they're a little bit larger, where it gets so crazy, you have to basically set up a service desk just to call when you don't know what service desk to call. Or I've been in organizations where they buy the same tool more than once from the same vendor just because one group wouldn't give the other group access to it. The reality is we are prime candidates, target-rich environments for looking at the world through a lean lens, because that's what really lean is all about. It's a way of looking at things through a lens that identifies issues that kill flow. Waste is one of those. One of the tools that we use in a lean toolkit is called a value stream. So here's an example of a value stream approach. It's a specific way to look at process through a standard value stream template that looks at a change process. And to kind of give you a sense of what you're looking at, let me describe a few things. So here are the steps in the process, right, relative to the change. These numbers here represent the estimated or theoretical time each step should take. So 10, 15, 45. This is the paper-based cycle time, which is the time that it should take from begin to end. But the reality is when I go and actually do an observation of what is truly happening, Lean would call this going to Gemba, going to where the work actually happens, I see a much, much different story. I start to see that sometimes the guest is not that far off, but in other areas, the actual time is what you're seeing here with the 75 versus the plan time, not at all. And what I'm seeing in a value stream, which I wouldn't necessarily see in a normal RACI workflow process model, swim lane diagram, is not just the time it would take to do a task, but the time relevant to waiting between tasks. So the interesting thing is here, we can start to get into calculations called process cycle efficiency. And what that demonstrates is what's the actual time that the process takes, right now 352 hours, over the lead time, which is the total time from the point of order to the point of delivery, including the wait. So what this demonstrates to me that this process time over lead time has a process cycle efficiency of only 6.6%. Not a great number, but the reality is it's not uncommon. But before I could even understand this, I had to visualize this. Again, this is visual management, making the invisible visible, making mistakes and errors visible. And so we can actually look at things like, that we have an error around wait time here. There's a clock that's demonstrating that. I have this rework issue. The form keeps getting thrown back, causing significant delay in wait time. I might have issues with quality that might be identified. All of these things are ways to visualize what is killing our flow. Until we actually put a process into a value stream orientation, we don't understand the implications of time, of waste, of flow. The final slide, and then we'll close it. So just to kind of talk through you some business scenarios. So we started this presentation with why should I care from a business perspective. Let me end it there as well. This diagram comes out of a book, which I referenced in 2 slides, we're just at the end, but just to give you a sense of where we are in the presentation. It's a book called Run, Grow, Transform. It's a book that I had the privilege of being a co-author on with Stephen Bell, one of the authors of Lean IT. And it focuses on kind of the cause and effect of making improvements. And we could look at that in the context of both products that we offer in our catalog or processes that we have in our environment around demand, plan, build, run. So let's just take it from the process or product side, doesn't matter. So let's say we begin to standardize on our products and processes. So what that standardization has as a cause and effect is because I now move from 3 ways of doing things down to 1, I reduce the cost. That's not bad. The speed of flow goes up. The variability, increasing defect, which increases the complexity, goes down, meaning my quality goes up. All of these have an implication on a customer experience because now I can actually alleviate price. I improve the user experience aspect. I'm focusing not just on the feature, but the warranty, the availability is improving. Now, that has an interesting impact on my customer engagement because I have customers today, business units that basically are buying shadow IT because they have no trust in what I do. They don't think I do it well. So now I'm actually starting to prove I can actually deliver on a consistent way and I can deliver on time, on budget. Guess what happens? I get loyalty increased. People actually want to talk to me now that wouldn't even take my calls before. I actually gain back market share from shadow IT, giving me even the opportunity to move into new markets and to do new strategic things. Not so bad. Because I've reduced the operating cost of my current products and services, I can actually return revenue, not necessarily back to the business, but I can actually now focus that on innovation now because that allows me to have cash flow and basically working cash flow increase because like working capital, the money tied up in existing services is going down, meaning that I can now focus on net new value versus legacy. Because I'm getting new customers, because of all of this wonderful world of standardization and optimization of flow and customer experience improvement, I actually get new funding because I'm now becoming a trusted supplier and a strategic advisor. So I'm gathering that probably no one thinks that this picture is bad. But this is the cause and effect of focusing on a lean orientation. All of it from a multidimensional perspective is true. So again, it's about thinking differently. It's about looking at things differently. Now, all of this basically can be summed up in the application of the lean principles to IT value streams. One of the things I'd like to bring to your attention is that at the beginning of 2015, a new association was formed called the Lean IT Association, and I'm proud to be a volunteer within LITA. And there's a whole now education path available to professionals in the IT industry to begin teaching lean principles. And those principles are applicable no matter where you are in the organization. If you're in the DevOps world, lean is a major part of that. If you're an agile or project or build specialist, it's all about improving flow and decreasing cycle time. If you're in the service management space, as you can see, it's all about looking at the value stream of strategy, design, transition, operation. The reality is we can learn a lot of benefit from the principles of lean applied to our industry. That certification model is represented on the website, Lean IT Certification, Lean IT Association website. And today, available to the market, there's a Lean IT Foundation class. It's been out for about a year and a half. Kaizen came out in September of 2015, and that's how to actually run Kaizen events. And just about to be released, I'm quite excited about this, is a course focusing on leadership and how do leaders encourage a culture of lean collaboration and lean thinking. Next year in 27, we expect the lean coach, the advisor role, to be brought out by the association. But this year, we'll have all 3 of these courses here available for you. For more knowledge about lean, there's a couple of sources that I recommend. One is the Lean IT book, kind of like the seminal book around this. Steve Bell has written another book I mentioned, Run, Grow, Transform. And I should have put this out here, but I haven't because I had forgotten to update it. But the co-author of Lean IT, Mike Orzen, also has a new book called The Lean IT Field Guide. Recently read it. It's an excellent book. It talks about the implementation of lean. I have a blog out there off of Pink Elephant's website where I do a lot of podcasts and blogs around lean. And Pink Elephant, of course, is a proud provider of lean education. And for that, just as a last parting gift, we have a Lean Foundation course just around the corner. And for the people that are on this webinar, we're offering you a special deal. We all like special deals, lean deals. 10% off if you're interested in taking this virtual class on Lean IT, March 14. And if you're interested, please simply contact Pink Elephant and we'll set you up with this offer. Thank you for your patience. I hope that you found this interesting, and I truly am passionate about what lean thinking helps us with and helps the organization in the context of increasing the premise of value creation through flow optimization. Thank you and have a great afternoon.